This is the We Witches 3 podcast, where you will hear the opinion of 3 seasoned witches who are tired of glossy, tunnel vision, love and light accolades about serious metaphysical topics. Your hosts, Charlene, Maria Sewell, and Heather Woodworth have been practicing witches and professional psychics for over 20 years. They not only have the experience, but they have the research to back it up. So get comfortable on your brooms, grab a snack, and get ready for a wild ride.
Can I get your qualifications real quick?
I have an associate's degree in archaeology, a bachelor's in anthropology, a master's in history, doctorate. I have, a doctorate in education from the University of New England, another doctorate in comparative religion. I have a couple certificates, one in human osteoarchaeology, one in archaeoastronomy. I'm a member of some professional organizations. One of them is really funny, actually, the Association of Ancient Historians. It doesn't mean I'm old. It's just I am old. It's so funny when the Association of Ancient Historians.
Nice.
The World Archaeological Congress. A couple others. I don't know if that helps, but
that sounds great.
Yeah. So there's some little credentials here and there, and then basically what I do. Basically what I did is I broke away from the mainstream, though. I turned down a traditional job in academia, like tenured and that sort of thing. I turned that down so that I could explore these alternative ideas on my own. So I'm more of an independent researcher now. On the side, I actually work as a consultant for museums, but that's not what I do. Tell you more about my thesis. Like my master's thesis examined the intersection of inequality, consumer culture, propaganda, and public education in early modern Europe. So that was that. My dissertation discussed the questions of the educational value of digital technologies in museums, that sort of thing. So
I'm becoming completely infatuated with you right now.
What sign are you?
Oh, I'm Capricorn.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
I'm like, she's got to be in her sign. Which her sign is it? She's got to be one of them.
Capricorn. I so believe in it's so funny because I so believe in astrology. I have zero clue as to how it works, and I don't necessarily, but I think there's something to it. That's all I can say. Everybody that I've met that's like, I can almost guess their sign. Like, yep, that's it.
It's so funny.
It's so funny.
It is. My mother was an astrologer, but I don't understand astrology hardly at all. But I have learned that I really admire Capricorns. Their organizational work ethic and neuroses is just a thing of beauty.
Yeah.
Their study and their work ethic and their attention to detail and thoroughness is just a thing of beauty. It's an art form in itself.
Yeah, their craziness is about just going to the next level.
So we're discussing your book that recently came out, but like you said, you wrote it 3 years ago, Evil Archaeology. And I don't know about you, Heather, but I am getting like the greatest time out of this book.
Yeah, I read it so I was reading it the last 2 days, and I was reading last night, and unfortunately, I picked all the parts about demons right before I went to sleep, which was probably not the best idea. I was a little scared. I mean, honestly, your detail in your book, I was a little bit afraid, and I'm not usually afraid of that stuff, but I was reading about your interview with your exorcist friend, and I was reading about Jesus, whether he was an exorcist and all this stuff. And I was like, okay, my brain is swollen right now. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to sleep. So
I'm sure human sacrifice didn't. Oh, thank you. I'm sure human sacrifice didn't help matters either. I do touch upon some sort of like gruesome things, but yeah.
Oh, I just loved it though. The great thing is it's like it kind of has a textbook feel to it, which for me is good. But I know most people would find that a little dry, except it's not that dry. There are definitely some opinionated statements in here. I appreciated how you remarked that kings tend to be narcissistic to begin with. So obviously King James just assumed all the witches were focused on him.
Oh yeah,
Right.
Why not? Because it's all about him.
Right.
So like little asides like that. Kings tend to be narcissistic to begin with. So of course he believed all the witches were against him in particular personally, and the devil especially hated his proficiency in writing, so obviously was out to get him. Like
Clearly. I mean, like, yeah.
There is no other conclusion.
Nope. Just narcissist. Yeah. Well, call a spade, I guess. Yeah, I try to make the book as educational as possible without making it too boring. I think that there's a fine line. I'll be honest, it's a struggle for me to write in a way that isn't dry, because for years and years through school, well into a decade of educational training for writing, like in academies, and very, I guess, dry is just how I write. And so for me to sit down and write something that is not loaded with a bunch of, $50 words and moreovers and, all this sort of thing, I always have to catch myself, like, is this leaning boring, or is this, how much of this can I just relax a little bit and have some fun with it? And so that's what I try to do with this book is, not be so lax that I didn't have, obviously correct sources and, based in actual history and whatnot, but I tried to balance it between something educational, but something also a little fun, maybe scary if, some people find being scared fun. So a little bit of fun. But it was difficult because there are some serious topics in here about, human sacrifice or possession or experiences that other people have had. And so, it was actually a challenge to do justice to their stories without making light of it, but at the same time, recognizing some of the maybe sillier aspects of beliefs as well. So sort of the haunted relics and, the things that maybe are fun and fun to think about, but maybe aren't based in so much truth. And, so there's a little something for everybody. At least that's what I hope comes across in the book. So I'm glad to hear that somebody enjoyed that aspect of it. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I read a lot of books. I mean, I'm always reading. I'm doing a lot of stuff right now, and so I'm always having to research. And your book was really, really easy to read. And the other thing, too, is you do have a voice. And so the way you talk right now, I can hear it in the book. And so, like, your vernacular is very close to how you write. And I love that, because I feel like you have a point of view versus you just giving me a bunch of stuff to read. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And that's I appreciate that feedback. That's really good to know, because yes, I do have a point of view. That is something when you write academically, you are discouraged from giving that point of view in a lot of ways. You have to write in a manner that is very objective. And while that's important for the academy, I think that in popular writing, it's good to be able to spread your wings and be a little more creative with how you discuss a topic, if anything, because it is your voice and it's your time to speak, and it's important. And in order to educate, you have to be able to engage people. And I think part of education is leaving people with more questions than maybe they started with. Not necessarily leaving them hanging. Answer the questions that you seek to answer, but then expand it for them. So my goal is so that when people read this, they think, oh, okay, I get it. But then they come away wanting to know more and maybe being able to launch into some Googling or something of their own, something where, it just makes them think a little bit more. They get curious about other things. So it's sort of like a gateway in a way. That's how I try to write.
Absolutely. And that's what I mentioned earlier. I was taking a lot of notes. Like, I need to follow up on this. I need to follow up on that. I need to know more and more and more. And I love too, the way that you have made it more personal, the things that you talk about, kind of contextualizing things.
Mm-hmm. I like to share my motivations for why I'm even doing this work with people, because, there's so many things to write about. Why did I choose this? Why this and what led me down this path. And something that I really like to do is treat subjects like an experience, like a journey, because for me, that's what it is. When you write or research, I'm looking into a topic. It's when I put my foot down and say, this is what I want to learn. This is what I want to research. I'm starting a journey. And what I want to do is not take that journey alone and then say, here you go, this is what I found out. I want to sort of take people with me on that journey of discovery as I write. So, I start by saying, this is what led me to this topic. This is what, I learned along the way. This is how my mind maybe has changed along the way, or what and so I kind of want the reader to come with me on this journey of exploration and see where it takes us.
That's fantastic. One thing that I remarked to my honey last night, I was talking to him about your book, and I said, one thing that really frustrates me when I'm learning about history is that how it's all very high level. Like, this is what the kings did, this is what the clergy did, this is this, that, and the other thing. But it makes it a real exercise to be like, okay, what does the everyday person's life look like? And you really did a good job of illustrating that in the book. When people are believing like in these fertility demons, what does that actually look like in their day-to-day practice? Mm-hmm. And what does that look like in their experience? And you start each chapter with these little vignettes of what an actual experience would look like. And I absolutely love that.
Oh, thanks. I really think it's important to experience history. I gotta say, for a historian, my least favorite subject in school was history. I hated it. I hated going to class. I was a musician, so I played in band and played French horn. I still am. I played in orchestra still, so it's not like it's gone. It's just I thought that was going to be my life focus at first, and I hated history, so I thought. Funny enough, though, I would spend a lot of time reading about history, or I would watch history documentaries, but when it came to school, I thought, I don't have the best rote memorization. And that's all it was when did this happen? Who did this happen to? Blah, blah, blah. Next chapter. Very boring. That's something that I really object to. And the further I got in my studies, just academically, that's something that I honed in on, was the way people are educated in history, and how a lot of times it's, people are done a big disservice in that regard. So, I feel that it's really important to not shy away from sharing a human element or putting a narrative to something, because that's definitely how you connect. And I think it's important for people to, look at history as a way to connect, and to connect to other humans, to connect to themselves. And you can't do that when you're just looking at a table of facts, like, this war happened on this day, and that's just not engaging. And so I think it's, for me, what's exciting is when I learn about history, I don't care about the dates. That stuff is just irrelevant. I care about what is happening in the minds of the people. What was it like back then? How can I take a mental time, machine into the past and experience these things? And so that's what I try to do for my readers as well, is just give them a glimpse into what it would be like to live in the past. And one of my history professors back in the day said something really, insightful to me, which was, don't worry about dates. We're not here to learn the dates. Don't worry about time periods. Don't worry about even the names. We're just going to learn about what happened, and all those dates and things, they'll start to click, because once you find that you care and you want to know, those things just happen automatically. And you have to first start by caring, and people care not about abstract things necessarily, like the numbers or letters or that. They care about the meanings behind it. They care about people. And so, I definitely want to try to give people a glimpse into, the experiences of the everyday person. I was really struck by a book I read a long time ago. We had to study it when I was in class, called What is History? It was a 1961 nonfiction book by E.H. Carr. It was on historiography. It basically, it came out of a set of lectures he did at the University of Cambridge. He was a very, very influential historian. He discusses the practice of history, and he introduces the idea of the, quote, everyman. And that really just hit home. It was exactly what you said, which was, for so long, history is about what the kings did, what the, clergy did. And while all that can be interesting in and of itself, it really just leaves a hole into, what the every person was doing. And so that's something that I studied for most of my schooling, which was, kind of turned itself into the idea of consumer culture. And, because I was really, really interested in the everyday lives of people. What did they eat? What did they wear? What did they think? What did they do? Just all of that stuff. And during what was going on in the bigger picture. So there's a whole other side to history, and that's something that interests me. So yes, as you mentioned, I discuss some of the things that people may have gone through. I open it with the account of trepanning, which is a little on the gory side, and maybe like a way to introduce people. Maybe it wasn't the best way to introduce people to the book. I think if you start reading it, you're either going to love that or you're going to hate it and put it down, because it might take a strong stomach. But yeah,
I loved it. So I think that's a great way. You don't want to like surprise them halfway through the book, and then they're like, "Oh, geez, I can't go any further." Like,
right?
Oh, too late. You already bought it.
Right. Thankfully, I was worried about that a little bit, but I was grateful that on the Amazon Peek Inside, they show that part at least. So it's like, okay, you know what you're getting yourself into then. It's a little gory, but it's not gory in a way that it's not gratuitous just for the sake of gore. It's actually an important component to learning how people did what they did and, lived how they did, So in the beginning, it's a Neolithic period. And so it's kind of important to paint out a picture to get a clear idea as to what was going on. And so all the details that I have in that trepanning account, or what trepanning is the drilling a hole in somebody's head. It's one of the oldest medical procedures known, if not the oldest. There's a definite process to that anthropologists have been able to determine how they would have done it, what, tools were used and how, and, all the different components to that. And so I take all those factual pieces and weave it into a narrative that would have basically been 100% true.
Right, like kind of the default story. And that is described in very much a medical way and not like a Stephen King way.
Right.
For anyone who's concerned.
Yes. It's not exploiting in any way. It's very much medical, very, very clinical, but can still, it's interesting. I found it something important to put in the book, because the book itself tries to look at where does the idea of these spirits or entities or evil or any of these supernatural forces, where did they start and how long have they been with us and how have they evolved since then? And so I didn't want to leave out the experiences of prehistory, because we can guess or make educated guesses about some of their motivations based on the evidence that we find.
I thought it was interesting because it's more realistic. I mean, everything you wrote about in this book, even though it's about demons, possessions, and sinister relics, I mean, that's the tagline, but these are real things that people believe. This is the stuff that we kind of whitewash when we learn about history. But this is the kind of stuff, if you're even in this field a little bit, this is the kind of stuff you hear about on a day-to-day basis. I mean, I was fascinated by some of the really interesting parts about Jewish mysticism or about shamanism that you point out. There's other ways of doing exorcisms besides the Vatican's way, which is what we see all the time. And that to me was fascinating, because I was like, oh my gosh, I have to go back into these subjects now and really find out more about it. And I don't know, for me, I felt like it was very eye-opening to see how people really think about these things versus how it's portrayed in movies or in the news.
Yeah, movies and pop culture have really shaped how we view demons and those ideas. I think second only to the Christianization of pagan religions, really. So I think those two forces together have really just reformed how we as humans think of the idea of demons or angels or any of those supernatural entities. As we were talking about the evidence of trepanning and the ancient people who they were doing that because they believed that drilling a hole in their head would allow imprisoned spirits or demons or other supernatural beings to escape. Now, some people have said, well, there's other reasons for that, and that's true. It's also used to lessen intracranial pressure after swelling, after an injury. There's a host of reasons it's been done, but another reason that has been established is this idea of releasing spirits. And so you see all these different ways that people have tried to rid themselves of these spirits. And a recognizable depiction of exorcism, one that we see in pop culture or movies, it can actually be found as far back as 4,000 years ago in Sumerian cuneiform tablets. Archaeologists have found many Mesopotamian medical texts that outline exorcism rites that appear very similar to those of the Catholic Church, the ones that are usually the default for images in movies and entertainment. So of the roughly 1,000 cuneiform tablets in the British Museum, 660 of them specifically reference exorcism.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so it's fascinating because some of the things that are similar, we still do. So the idea of the priest having to demand the name of the demon, that was something the Sumerians did. And the reason they did that was because, well, it was part of their medicine. And so for them, the name of the demon was essentially a diagnosis. So if they knew, okay, this patient or this possessed person, exhibited signs of, say, nausea or sweating or fever, however, then it could be this demon responsible. Those were the telltale signs. And so essentially what they were doing was a primitive, well, if you could call it primitive, maybe that's not giving them enough credit, but it was an earlier form of medical diagnostic practice. So they would say, well, if it's all of these symptoms, then you are possessed with this demon. And if it's this demon, then we know how to deal with that demon. You take this pill, which the Sumerians were the first to invent pills. So they actually had pills, capsules. They had different salves. They had, all sorts of things. And they would say, well, maybe you don't just take 2 of these and call me in the morning. It would be take 2 of these and we're going to stay with you overnight, pray over you, perform some ceremonies and rituals and all of this. And so how they knew what to do would be determined by the name of the demon, which was then the name of the illness per se. So it was sort of an early way that they were trying to work out how to perform medicine. And so in that sense, it's actually quite advanced. But another method that the Sumerians did that maybe wasn't so advanced, but is actually funny, is that in my opinion, it was very funny, they modeled clay figures of demons in order to have them battle. And so in the book, I liken it to a primitive game of rock'em sock'em robots. The priest would instruct the patient to make a figurine of a demon, and then the patient would raise his hands and say, "That unknown ghost, I have made a figurine of him." Then the priest would purify a clay pit by putting wheat flour into it. And the next morning, they would say into the pit, "I will buy clay from the potter's pit for a representation of what is evil." And then they would have to pinch off the clay and make a figurine of the male and female witch. And so they had this idea of witches. It was still the similar idea. The idea of witch is very similar to how we would look at it now. It's just changed as well. But it was the idea of this, not necessarily demon, but the person acting on behalf of the demon. So then the patient would present those figures of the demon and then the witches, and they would put the figures in and pray that the demon takes the clay figures as a substitute, sort of like a clay scapegoat, and hope that the spirit would leave the body, go into the figures. And in the ancient texts actually describe how to make the clay figurines. You were supposed to take the clay from a potter's pit and mix it with tallow and wax. Then you would say 3 times to the evil spirits, you would say, "Like myself, his flesh is like the appearance of my flesh. I've mixed clay from the pure mountains, tallow and wax, and I've made a representation of him." And then you'd pose the figure, and then you'd even feed it and take care of it. And you'd feed it, and you'd say, "Eat this. You are my substitute." And then you'd give him a drink and demand that he drink and say, "Drink. You have been provisioned, and this has been given to you." And then you'd say, and this is a quote, "Little dwarf, you have been completely fitted out as my substitute." And so then the spirit would supposedly enter the clay figure, and a separate clay figure of the adversarial demon, the demon that was known to be against, the demon that was in question, it would be placed into this clay pit so that they could fight. And it was like, okay, now we're going to fight. So in my mind, I'm imagining these, respectable priest class figures of the ancient time, basically playing in a pit with clay, little action figures. And I mean,
right, like Marvel figurines or something.
Yes. And so it's funny because, in the text, it's very ceremonial and ritual. But if you really think about what they're doing and just imagine the scene of them, essentially playing, but that's sort of what they did. And that's why that they had this idea that there was a demon and they would have adversarial demons. And so in that sense, demons weren't always completely bad. They had helpful attributes. And that is the case with Pazuzu, the demon that's on the cover. Pazuzu was, clearly a not a very good demon, judging by his appearance. He's quite scary. But the reason we have so many depictions of Pazuzu to even know what he is and what he looks like is because he was the most popular figurine for people to wear and to have as an amulet and talisman. And the reason for that is that he would protect pregnant women. And so, and the reason he protected them is that, well, he had a wife named Lamashtu, and she couldn't have babies. And she was very jealous then. And so she would go out and steal babies out of jealousy, or she would just kill them. And that was their explanation for sudden infant death. And in order to prevent that, you'd want to have a Pazuzu plaque near your bed, or a pregnant woman would sleep with a Pazuzu necklace or amulet, something to have Pazuzu near. Because the idea was that since Pazuzu was the domineering husband, he could literally whip his wife into submission and make her stop. And so there's a lot of depictions of Pazuzu and, some of the carvings. He is holding a whip and he's just beating his wife, and the wife's trying to claw up from the underworld to, steal babies. And it's quite a story.
There was a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna back you up a little bit here. First, with the clay figure, I find that especially fascinating because we actually still do similar things in modern practice today with puppets and voodoo dolls and corn dolls and doll babies and stuff like that. Creating the sympathetic representation is still a magical practice in modern times.
Yes, that is fascinating too. It's something that is definitely done in modern times, and it's something that, while it may have had roots in the Near East, it's traveled throughout and has become firmly entrenched in Western culture as well, and the ideas that we have of, witchcraft in that sense, that like a more Western esotericism component of witchcraft. It's, a lot of these things that, we see in this modern idea or this Western notion of witchcraft or, any of these arts. They have been framed by a Christian society as being, bad, or this is however they want to, compartmentalize it. It's definitely something that has roots in folk practice and paganism. And what's fascinating to me throughout is that it's not just the local folk arts and paganism. It has traveled and been passed on all the way since the beginning of civilization. There's elements you can still recognize. So even if you're looking at, something as far off as Ireland, or, even if once it's traveled to the, Northeast coast and, New England or something. So you see all these things, and we definitely attach those ideas to the Western sense of witchcraft or something. But it really can be linked to some of these very ancient practices that have just never gone away. They've Absolutely. Just evolved or changed.
And just for the sake of fascination, I guess, how long ago were the Sumerians practicing that? Like, what year would that be?
It was about 4,000 years ago.
That's incredible.
They're the oldest. Well, I'm going to say they're the oldest civilization. There will be people that say, no, there's Göbekli Tepe. And this is true. There's Göbekli Tepe, but Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which is estimated to be about 10,000 years old. It is a hunter-gatherer settlement, and it is not necessarily, it doesn't have the components of an actual permanent settlement and civilization, the defining factors being high arts and culture, sciences, and, permanent settlement in that regard. And so the one that we know of that is the oldest and actually the source of many of the amazing scientific discoveries that, we still use today is ancient Sumer.
It's incredible, though. 4,000 years. Now, I also wanted to ask you to talk about the word demon, because it's used in several different ways throughout the book, because it's got a history, right?
Yes. The word demon is, again, it's I like to, in the book, kind of play with etymology or remind people about what it is that we're actually saying on a daily basis. And so I start by questioning the word inspire, because I start by, as you know, introducing this true crime that occurred, and where the criminal was cannibalizing and murdering his neighbors, and he had legally changed his name to Pazuzu. And he did this and was inspired. Hit me like, well, the Latin for inspired is inspirare, and it meant it originally meant to breathe or blow into, and it was specifically referencing a supernatural being that would breathe or blow into somebody an idea. And so, the concept of doing something in spirit or in the spirit of, well, that's sort of, if you take it in that literal sense, it meant that some supernatural entity gave you an idea, and that's you're inspired to do so. So it's attributed to something outside of yourself, and generally something supernatural. So there's all these notions where we use these words: inspired, possessed, demon, and we're a lot of times using them in the modern context. So if I say demon, it's going to mostly, for me, what I think of when someone says demon is the big, crazy red guy from that old movie with Tom Cruise, Legend.
Tim Curry.
I love that. So I'm thinking demon. That is the ultimate demon.
Yes.
Just red and huge horns, and it's just some scary. That's
the best.
Demon. He's the best. The absolute best
yes.
demon. Yes. And so that's a demon. But really, if you look at how the word demon has been used through history in a literal sense, the etymology of it, it didn't really represent that. I mean, that's a whole thing to unpack there, because that particular demon, the idea of this horned or cloven-hooved entity that was, evil, that's a construct that came from the literal demonization of the pagan entity Pan, who most people recognize as like a friendly satyr. He might have been friendly. Some people recognize him from, very well portrayed in the movie Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So you have this guy here with the, little goat body, and he's all playful and everything. But, he was really well regarded in the ancient, Greek pantheon, because he represented sex and partying and wine and fun and music, and he was the party guy. It's a celebration. It was a celebratory entity. In a more dogma-oriented religion, Christian religion came along. And when I say that, I'm not disparaging Christianity, because I'm, a practicing Episcopalian, so it's just a fact. There's facts don't care about your feelings kind of thing. So the fact is, yes, the Christian church came and, made these entities, these gods, these pagan beliefs, demons, so that they would be discouraged from engaging in those festivities or things. So the idea of Pan being such a happy, party guy, well, all of those things are very anti-doctrine of Christianity, of, free love and nature and, drunkenness and partying. That's a no. And so they would use those figures as sort of propaganda against the people and say, these are evil. Look at these bestial type beings that are going to try to tempt you into doing things. And they just tried to use those as scare tactics to make people shy away from the old beliefs and cling literally out of fear to the new beliefs as a source of problem, solution, salvation, that kind of thing. So they made the problems and then offered the solution, and so that sort of thing happened. And that's why we have the idea of demon being what it is, this horned, and there's so many things about that. I mean, that's the symbolism with horns, and it just goes so far back, but that's just a rough idea as to why we think that the devil has those cloven hooves and the big horns, and he may be red, and he kind of, in a more creative way could look like the guy from, the movie Legend. But that's not the accurate way that the ancients thought of as demons. Or the Greek word was actually daemon, and it represented a spirit or divine power. The Latin term for that then ended up turning into genius. So the concept, And so, and then that was the Roman, the Greeks provided all the backstory for the Romans. So the Romans, the Roman religion, the genius, or plural genie, were these divine, right? And so, yeah. And so you can see when you trace the etymology of these, the origin of these words, how these things are kind of changing and adapting. But the original daemon of classical mythology was not necessarily bad or good. In fact, probably one of the most notable examples appears in the work of Plato, where he is describing Socrates, and Socrates' self-proclaimed, inspiration from the demon. So he actually, if you're familiar, most people are familiar with the fact that Socrates was put to death for corrupting the minds of the youth. And it's an interesting thing to consider, because they didn't really want to put him to death. He was a very well-respected person, even though he was controversial, and they didn't want to cause, a big uproar. So they threatened him with death, but they were really trying to get him to move and get out and banish himself. But Socrates had a window of thinking, he wanted to think about this, and upon thinking about it in reflection, his personal daemon told him to face up to it. And so he went with it and offered himself to, the law, turned himself in, and then he was subsequently killed. But he consulted with these daemons, and it was not at all like he was devil worshiping. I mean, that wasn't even a thing. It was classical antiquity. But what it was this idea that it was like the conscious, the inner voice, the something else, that is beyond your physical form, but somehow giving you maybe inorganic or ideas that aren't original to you, but that they're coming from somewhere else. And so this is something where the very origins of the word demon, they weren't necessarily bad. They weren't necessarily good. They could do bad or they could do good. It wasn't a judgment call. These weren't questions of ethics or morality. They were just ways of understanding the human experience. And it was later that they became ethical and moral judgments, whether they be good or bad, and they had to be parsed and put into those, categories. But that wasn't how it was intended, which is why it can be very confusing when reading, ancient texts, to say, well, wait a minute, Lucifer was this beautiful angel, the most beautiful in heaven. Then why does Lucifer turn into the devil? And how did this happen? And it's exactly why. It's because these stories are, come from a different time, culture, and understanding, and they've been transformed and changed over time to fit the dominating narrative. And then Hollywood was invented, came along and made stuff look oh so memorable, and our reference points have been stuck to those things now. And so if I say demon, well, who knows what it'll conjure up, but I would guess that at least 3 out of 5 times it's going to conjure up something out of a movie.
If you aren't listening to this on Podcoin already, you totally should be. Podcoin is the podcast player that pays, and you can get it on Android or iPhone for free. You get points just for listening to your favorite podcasts, and then you can trade them in for gift cards or donate your points to charity. I use it to listen to all my podcasts already, and it's been really great. You can use our invite code WITCHES, and you'll get 300 Podcoins just for signing up, and get paid just to listen to us. And we want you to be a bunch of rich witches, so you're welcome.
Do you get obsessed about the faces on Mars? Are you a fan of the X-Files, Fringe, or Slenderman? Listen to the Envious Aliens podcast with your host, Heather Woodworth. On this show, she gives you a deep dive into topics that don't usually get covered or see the light of day. The spooky, the weird, the macabre, the paranormal, and of course, aliens. Envious Aliens podcast. Find us at podcast.enviousaliens.com. That's podcast.enviousaliens.com. See you there, and don't forget to bring your tinfoil hat. podcast.enviousaliens.com.
I wanted you to talk about one of the most interesting parts of the book for me was you were talking about being younger and going on a road trip and seeing a exorcism in real life and the 4 scapegoats wandering down the walkways.
Yeah. Well, I was in a small town in South Carolina. The population was less than 300 people. For such a just very small area, there were a lot of churches. It was a very religious area, as I guess you might expect in like the rural South. So one evening, acquaintance that I had there invited me to attend a church service on the outskirts of town, and it was a small Christian church. It was a really, really interesting time, to say the least. It started out kind of, I don't want to say ominous, but I guess for full disclosure, it was a little ominous to me because I wasn't really told a lot about what was going on, and so I had my own ideas, like, oh, this is church service, okay. But going, in that area, there wasn't a lot of light. It was a heavily rural area, and it was a literal dirt road that was leading to the church. And it was very humid summer night. And so, we approached the church, and it looked more like a house that had been retrofitted with a ramp and just a couple stained glass windows. So it was a church. It had a little sign, but it just looked like a house. There was no parking lot. Most people were just parking in the grass beside the building. And so at this point, I'm like, this is interesting. This is different than, what I grew up with in terms of the, incense and bells and things of high church services. And so, I was fascinated because I love learning about different belief systems. And so I was like, this is going to be fun, although it was a little ominous in some ways. And, I was waiting, and the people started going into the church. Everything still looked fine. It was a little, how should I put it? It was quaint. It was very quaint. People seemed to know each other. They were neighbors. They all knew each other, and maybe they had been doing this a long time, getting together in the same building. And so they were very friendly with each other. And I felt I felt welcome. But I also felt that I was on the spotlight because I was definitely not someone they were used to seeing, because just for the simple fact that nobody would visit them. It was just a small town, very tight knit community. And so, I go in, and things started going just as you would expect. Preachers preaching, and songs are being sung, and but the preacher, he was very exuberant, and he was jumping all around and running. And, I was thinking, oh, they're going to pull out snakes any minute here, and they didn't, but they might as well have, because they were, speaking in tongues and doing these things. And it was amazing because even the children were, and there were all sorts of kids, and they were rolling on the ground, and things started getting really, really eccentric. And then there was the platform up at the front where it was like maybe one step up, and then up there was the podium where the preacher was preaching. And to his left, there was a door. While everybody was paying attention to the preacher and talking and, having a good time speaking in tongues, somebody had wheeled a woman in a hospital bed out onto this platform. And she looked as though she was just sleeping. She was very haggard, and she wasn't elderly, but she may have been in her late 40s or early 50s, but she looked so haggard. She could have been in her 30s and looking like 50s, or 40s and looking like 60s, or who knows. She didn't look well. She didn't look her age, but she also didn't look well. Like she had a disease potentially. And clearly she couldn't walk, and she was in a hospital bed. So one by one, members of the church congregation gathered around the bed. And my friend that took me there looked over at me, and after really saying not much until now, asked if I had anything to confess, because they were about to do an exorcism. And I was kind of taken back.
Surprise.
I know, because I was like, well, to me, I a former Catholic, I was raised Catholic. An exorcism meant priests, crucifixes, heads spinning, the whole nine. And so I wasn't sure why a confession would be something that I'd be asked to provide. So, and I obviously didn't want to, I'm a bit of an introvert, so I didn't want to draw any attention to myself. So I said, oh no, I'm fine, thanks. And so, then I was really intrigued. And so I actually got up to get a little closer look. And there were about, a handful of people left in the pews. Everybody else was just up there watching the action. And so the woman in the hospital bed, she starts kind of moving around and just groaning, and the preacher put his hands over her, and then she started speaking in tongues, as though she kind of came alive, but not quite, because she didn't look very with it in her face. She just looked distant, and she continued to just moan and writhe. And then from the door where she came from, they opened it and goats came out. Just a couple aimless, clueless goats were walking out, about 4 of them. And at this point, I just thought, wow, okay, things are getting really weird here. And yeah. And so, and I'm trying not to judge, but because I'm actually just quite fascinated, but I was a little also not sure, because this was something I had never experienced. So the woman in the bed started just getting so red in the face. She looked like she was going to stroke out. Her vocalizations then got really weird and started oscillating between just shrieking and high-pitched noises to just guttural growling. Then she was sort of trying to make out a word, and the only thing you could hear was "Alu." And that's when the preacher said, "Demon, is that your name?" And then the woman just kept saying, "Alu, Alu." And so this thing continued for an hour. And at some point, people started getting more quiet and subdued, and some of the children were starting to fall asleep. But the preacher never left the woman's side. He just kept going with this and praying over her. And then, as if just waking from, a fever dream, the woman sits up, puts her arm around the preacher and grabs him. And I'm thinking, oh, she's attacking him. What's going on? But no, she pulled away and looks at him, and then she looked like she was there. She made eye contact with him, and then the congregation members clapped and cheered as if they knew what was happening. Still, the goats are just walking around aimlessly, and it was a little bizarre. But I'm looking at the goats, I'm looking at the woman, I'm seeing everything that's going on, and before I knew it, she gets up, and people are helping her into the room that is adjacent to the main area where all this happened, and they were just congratulating her and hugging her and showing her all this support. And then there was a literal punch and cookies waiting for everybody. Okay. And then, so there was a step-in bathtub that they had used for baptisms, and the preacher escorted the woman over to the tub, fully clothed, and baptized her. But so they had a little after party that continued for about another hour. The whole thing out the door took about 4 hours.
Wow.
And it was just as an attendee, it was exhausting. And, and so this was before I had actually gone back to school, and, because, gone back to school, I had left home at 16 and never finished school. And I went on some quite strange adventures, and, performed my own personal ethnography, attending a bunch of different temples and churches, and exercising my fascination with the spiritual. And so obviously that wasn't going to set me up for a great life. And so I did go back to school. So this happened before I went to school. And so when I went back to school, I studied anthropology, the parent field of archaeology. And that's when things started, maybe making a little more sense to me. And looking back on that experience, it put it in a different perspective. It wasn't until afterwards, though, during the experience, that on the way home, I had to ask about the goats, because I was, vegetarian. I'm very curious
about the goats.
I was really curious about the goats, because they just had it was so random. There was no context, and no one talked about it. And so at this point, I asked about the goats, and my friend that brought me there explained that the goats were going to be slaughtered and sacrificed. Yes, because they were literal scapegoats. They had used them to get rid of the demon that possessed the woman. And then but he tried to assure me, don't worry, because, the meat we're going to use for the food pantry, I'm like, oh, okay.
Feed people demonic goats.
Right. I mean, that's so funny. And I didn't even think about that until somebody else I told that story to actually said that, and they said, wait a minute, wouldn't the meat be demonic? And I'm like, it would be. It's demonic burgers. No, thank you. But I was a little sad about that, because they were cute. They were just like, farm goats. Like, they weren't like the kind like the big ones. They were actually really small, and animal lover and vegetarian. And so I was like really sad about that. But other than that, it was just something interesting. And so it stayed with me always, this experience, that it was just learning then in my studies, I would look back at that and look at it in changing perspectives through time. It happened when I was younger, and through the changing, perspective that I gained through education and experience and learning about the, ancient demonology, it always just put it in a different light that was, I felt important to sort of add it in the book. It was also interesting. I found a name in the ancient demonology list that was Alu. That was, so that kind of, that, I don't know, it was a scary Sumerian demon, Alu, that had no limbs, ears, or face. And he hovers over people at night as they sleep and would bind their arms, legs, tongue, and cause sleep paralysis, and then ultimately possess the people. So it's sort of interesting. But, again, Alu is not a grammatically complex word. It could just be an utterance, an easy combination of sound. But it always, that still is something that I found fascinating. And you never know. You just never know. Maybe they understood. Maybe they had studied Sumerian demons. Maybe that was something that was, power of suggestion. Who knows? But it was enough to lead me even more, make me a little more curious. So, yeah, weird thing. There may be people listening too that are like, oh yeah, we do that at my church, but and that's great. It just, for me, that wasn't something I was used to. So it really led me down a path of inquiry.
I think anyone who experienced that would be like, what the hell did I just see?
Well, I think it's so funny too, because we tend to view Christian practices in America as very homogenous.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that, and then we think of other religious practices as really foreign. And so that kind of demonstrates the depth and variety of just Christian practice in America.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
So that's kind of fascinating in and of itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of diversity in the ways people practice, regardless of what denomination or belief system they adhere to. There's so much variation, and it is dependent on, the geography, the people, their experiences, and just anything. But so it is fascinating too, especially to see how things can, even when they look different, I've noticed a binding thread that, even if it's a very thin thread, there's still something there that links us to practices and traditions of the past, and that's something that I find deeply fascinating.
Your fascination is apparent in the book, and it makes it that much more fascinating.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad to hear that, because it is a passion. When I get onto something, it's definitely my thing. Maybe that comes from being Capricorn.
I think it does. My mom is a Capricorn.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And she's like that. When she's fixated on something, there's just got blinders on. There's no getting around it until she changes her mind, and then all of a sudden, that's what I thought all along. And they're like, oh, okay, you just figured out that minute. Okay, cool. But
Yep.
it's a good trait though, because I really feel like there's a lot of stuff here. It's not just one person's point of view, and I can definitely tell from reading it that you have a Christian background. I mean, that comes out clearly. But it's not to the point where you're like, and this is what I believe in this, you should believe this too. It's more like, well, yeah, I do come from a religious background, and there's all these other things too, which I think is really amazing.
Yeah. I try to keep it separated. It's impossible, really. I mean, no matter what and who's looking at something, you are going to be biased. It's just a human fact. And so for me, it's better to just say, hey, I approach subjects, as objectively as possible, but there is a reality here, and here's my bias. And that's something that, when you do research, you always look for the bias in the research. And that's not to discount it. It's just to observe it and acknowledge it so that you can navigate it properly. And so, I think it's a professional standard to actually admit your bias going in so that you can show people, hey, okay, this is where I'm coming from. Okay, now that we have that out of the way, blah, blah. But I definitely don't want to, I think religion or spirituality is a lot of times deeply personal, or at least for me, it's personal. Some people put it out there and that's fine. That's their thing. But to me, it's very personal. And so it's definitely not something I try to push on others. And especially since it's taken me a long time to get to where I am spiritually. Like I said, I was brought up Catholic, but we were not Catholic in any meaningful sense. I just went to Catholic schools and, was told I'd go to hell for playing with a Ouija board. That was about the extent of my Catholicism. And so it was like more of a it was, we're not allowed to watch The Exorcist, but we're going to anyway kind of Catholicism, you know? So it was basically superstition based, and it really wasn't that developed. However, I fell in love with the music of the church, and I found my spirituality in music, and liturgical music and classical music, and you know, that sort of thing, and the visual aesthetics of it, the high architecture, the arts of that, and that sort of thing resonated with me. Everything else didn't, and so I just was like, okay, forget this. And I went and studied every religion you could because I was a seeker, and you know, I really adopted Buddhism for the longest, and I still actually practice Buddhism because, you know, it's a way of life and not necessarily a religion in the sense that we understand it. So you can practice it and, you know, do other things, but. Yeah, so for me, I have a much more complicated way of believing, and especially with history, like learning history, of course, you go in and you find out the origin of a lot of these beliefs, and you have a choice. You can either like say, no, that's not true, or, you know, maybe take a fundamentalist approach, like, you know, you find dinosaur bones and you say, well, wait a minute, that didn't happen. That's the devil's work, and say, okay, it's the dinosaur bones. I think you know, you can deny science, or you can, you know, just say, okay, so this is what it is. And it's not threatening your beliefs. It's just making you understand things a little bit more. And so it took me a long time to circle back to Christianity. And it was only because I, you know, was so drawn to the music and the celebration of the Western arts that, you know, I just happened to find a church that worked for me, the Episcopalian faith, which some people refer to as Catholic light, but it's actually not very light because they have all the beautiful things and aesthetics that I like. It's just, they're more accepting. It's not full of dogma and that sort of thing. And so for me, it was a perfect fit. It wouldn't be a perfect fit for everybody, but that was just where I came to find my home, was a place where I could still have those traditions of the music and the, you know, liturgy and everything, but not have to, you know, give up my seeking still. I still seek, I still look, and I read the Gnostic text. I love the Gnostic text. I incorporate many different faiths into my faith journey, and that's something that, you know, is deeply meaningful to me, and I'm very grateful to have come full circle in life. I don't have it all figured out. I don't think anyone ever will, but I'm excited when I'm able to share just information about the past and sort of how we're all connected. I think that's really important too, because there's so much division. And I think that spiritual beliefs are beautiful and should be cherished. And there's not one that's better than the other, or right or wrong, you know, unless you're speaking of one that's very murderous, and, you know, you could, you know, make an argument for anything. But I think what's more important is to, you know, look at what binds us, what holds us together. And I think the way that you can do that is by examining its trajectory through history. When you trace it back to its roots, you find that, you know, we all started in the same place. We were all together, and we've taken divergent paths, and celebrate those differences and come together where we can, and not try to literally demonize everybody else.
I think the whole mutually exclusive spiritual beliefs is a very Western practice. And that hasn't been true for all of our history all over the world. There's a lot of times and places where people have practiced co-religions. That's much more common in Eastern practices than it is in Western practices.
Exactly.
One beautiful example where you did talk about your bias in the book that I actually told my honey about it when I read it, is I think you were talking about possession ritual in Mongolia, where they were calling in a spirit.
Yes.
And you were talking about the swastikas on the costumes.
Yes. And that is, that's a great example of bias, because we all have bias. We just can't help it. We're enculturated. And when you study the past or even the present and just different cultures, it is so important to try your best to put those biases aside, to see the actual facts in front of you. And this was an instance where I, saw in this small group of government officials and researchers in Mongolia that they were gathering together in a hotel conference center to actually have a possession ritual. It was intentional possession. They wanted someone to be possessed. And this is something that they actively practice in different parts of the world, especially in the East. And so this was a 68-year-old woman who was a shaman, and she had 2 apprentices, and they were dressed in these bright colored fringed costumes and, dancing. And, it was quite a visual representation of tradition, yet in a conference center. And so it was that in and of itself was striking. They were there doing their thing and having bells and mirrors and coins and all these different things that they have in their traditional approach. But something that I thought was really, it just hit me. They were using a swastika in this. At first, it struck me as a little uncomfortable, but that was only in a moment. It was just because the swastika, represents, Nazism. But that's an inaccurate, use of that. I mean, now it is. Now we can't use a swastika unless it's, denoting Nazism, which is, understandable. But that's not its original, meaning. And so these shamans were using their drums, and on the drums they had swastikas all over them. And I remember, seeing this, it was like, wait, like the little record skip, like, what? Oh. But see, that wasn't what it meant to them. And that's not what the swastika, that's not what it was to begin with. That sign was co-opted by the Nazis, unfortunately. And so it's actually a sign. It's a religious icon, and it came out of Eurasia, and it's a sign of divinity and spirituality and often luck and that kind of thing. So it's more of a protective figure. It comes from Sanskrit. This is very well documented and very ancient. But of course, that's one of the things that the Nazis saw was this symbol that was linked to what they considered an Aryan race. And they adopted that as their symbol of like good fortune and success. And, and so now, if you see a swastika, it's just the first thing I'm thinking is Nazis, this is a anti-Semitic thing happening. And just, and even if I can override that and know better, sometimes the symbols are so strong that if anything, it can give you a sense of unease, at least until you are familiar enough with it.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciated how you had talked about that moment where it hit you, and then you had to like talk to yourself and be like, nope.
Yeah,
that's me.
Yeah.
That's all just me.
That's just me. I have to let that go and try to, it's about being open. You have to hear people out, and you have to have an open mind and an open heart, especially. And so even if you're looking at something like this happening in front of you and there's something that you maybe object to somehow, that's you. That's not them. That's not what it means. It's not the truth. That's just something you're harboring. And it's good to acknowledge that and move on. Or, in a particular case, maybe it's important that you acknowledge it and it matters. But in this case, it's my mistake and my misunderstanding, my subconscious or knee-jerk reaction to that symbol.
Yeah, and I think when you're relaying information in this book, you've done a really brilliant job of explaining like the difference between historical connotation and modern connotation when it comes to words and symbols.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that's, important because we are really just a product of our environment now. And we live in such a fast-paced and a communicative world. And I think when we have this mindset, it's what some people call the curse of knowledge. So if we look back at history, we sometimes forget that, it's the way that we're seeing things is just not the way the people interpreted things then. And to look at it through our modern lens or contemporary lenses, it's like it's like me looking at a swastika and thinking, oh, I have this modern understanding of it. And that's going to potentially, if I don't recognize it, pollute my whole understanding of what's in front of me that, is far greater than just the sign of the swastika. And it's, you have to do that. You have to try to, look past the clutter or, quiet the mind or however you want to put it, but shut out modernity a little bit and really just cut to the heart of things and relate to people at a very human level. And I think sometimes we're losing our humanity now in the contemporary culture, especially with technology. So I think that, it makes it easy for us to be very judgy.
Wow, this is such an amazing interview right now. My brain is just like, oh my goodness, I have so many things to look up.
Right. I could, I kind of want to talk with her again. about her other
I do
books.
too. I want to talk about everything that you know. Like, I want to talk to you for 8 hours about everything you know.
I'm ready to take your course, really. Like, if you start teaching again.
Oh, I'm actually going to teach online classes. I have an organization I've started called the Society for Truth and Archaeological Research, or STAR.
Ooh,
And
Star.
yeah, and on that site, I will be offering courses on all sorts of things, and some of them a little out there, and some of them actually very beneficial, like how to understand BS and how to, differentiate between sources and do that sort of research. So very helpful stuff, but then also maybe some fringe topics as well that I wouldn't be able to get away with at university. So
You are speaking my language right now.
I would love to come back. I definitely want to. I have another book coming out soon enough, and that one will be on the Anunnaki. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Oh my God.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so I'll be doing that. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'm looking into the UFO phenomenon, and that's like I just announced my book that I'm currently writing. And that is Xenoarchaeology.
Yes.
And that is the final frontier. It's going to be about the plans for research in space archaeology, if that makes sense. But there are actual plans being laid right now and methodologies, how to deal with the search for extraterrestrial life on other planets and that sort of thing. So and it kind of corresponds with the work that, I have the Land of the Watchers and the Sumerian controversy, the idea of covert or secret archaeological digs and why. And that's something that I got into it just kind of fell on me. And then people introduced me to the sort of, I guess, ancient alien theory. And I started coming across a lot of different things in the research, and a lot of out there things, but a lot of legitimate things as well. And I made it a really, big part of my job, so to speak, to sort through all that and find out what, if anything, is true and re-examine some of these ancient tablets, because I love looking at these tablets and researching this. And there's so many and so much, and not a lot of it is out there for people. And I don't know that it's all conspiracy oriented. I just think it's because of a lack of people publicizing things. There's a lack of public outreach and a lot of history and archaeological endeavors. But if you know where to look and know where to find it, there's just so much information out there. And so, I do have a book coming out. Like I said, after this one, I'd love to come back and talk about. It's called The Anunnaki Connection, and it will be all about my personal findings in examining the work of Sitchin and others. And I treat it like I do evil archaeology. I'm not a debunker. That's not what I try to do. But I'm also not a person who's trying to, promote some sort of idea and have confirmation bias in that either. I like to try to look at things, as an outsider looking in. Even though I'm an insider, I try to position myself in a way where it's like, okay, let's start from the beginning and let's unpack all of this and see where it leads. And then I add my own sort of like ideas in there, like, well, I did see this, and maybe it could be this, and and I interview some people as well, and so I'm really looking forward to that. So yeah, if you're interested, I'd love to share that as well, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about all my work. It means a lot.
We appreciate it. I think you just sung Heather's song.
Yeah, Anunnaki and tulpas are like my two favorite things in the world. So.
Well, she also mentioned ancient aliens and searching for life on other planets. I mean, Heather, you got to get all over that.
Yeah, I just came back from Alien Con.
Oh, did you?
Yeah,
awesome.
So I'm kind of obsessed. I have another podcast just about aliens. So yeah.
I love that topic. I've always loved that topic, but it's not really my bailiwick. It's not like I'm not a physicist and I'm not a hard scientist.
Right.
I've always, looked into those things, and it wasn't until recently that I just put my foot down and I said, I'm going to look into this in the way that I know how to do, in the way that I can contribute. And that was with the book that I'm researching. But then it just hit me like, a ton of bricks recently when Bob Lazar was on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he has said, quote, at least one of the flying saucers was part of an archaeological dig, which means it's not just old, it's ancient. And I heard that and I was like, wait, what? Double take? And, that really got me thinking. And I was like, wow, I'm going to have to look into this. And so I'm launching an investigation through my organization, my research organization to try to find out what kind of truth is there to that. And is a lot of these guys who are into MUFON and in these, the alien phenomenon, they are nuts and bolts guys, and that's important and we need them. But there's other ways to look at a subject. And I believe in taking an interdisciplinary approach to things. And so whereas I'm not necessarily the nuts and bolts person, like I'm not going to know how to make something fly or by any means, I can look into this aspect of it, which is, the claims that possibly flying saucers that are being hidden by the government may have been part of an archaeological discovery. And that's something that I thought, oh, wow, that's an interesting thing here. Let me look into that a little bit further. And so I started reaching out to contacts. I know a lot of people in the field and trying to gather the information together. And because most people said, well, how would you begin to look? But it's like, no. I had ideas. Like there's a process of elimination. There's ways to look at this. But I believe that with enough research, I may just be able to find if it's true, if what Bob Lazar is saying is true. And that's a big if. But if it's true, where might possibly have been the location of this archaeological dig?
Where can we find you? If somebody wants to get a hold of you, do your classes, any of that, where do we find you?
Everything is on my website. It's like a portal to everything. So it's www.drheatherlynn.com. It's drheatherlynn.com. And that's it'll have links to just interviews and events and my blog, books, and links to where you can get the book. It has links to the podcast that I do on occasion, Digging Deeper, and the STAR organization, which is the Society for Truth and Archaeological Research, where people can sign up to be a member there.
Okay, and I also want to mention that we did just have an off-the-record conversation that I can't talk about because it's off the record, but you guys had better follow her.
Yes. Yes.
And we will put that link in the show notes for this episode of the podcast as well. So definitely click her link and stalk her everywhere she is because she's incredible, all the stuff that she's working on.
I concur with all of that. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really great to meet you. And thank you so much. Let's do this again. It was so much fun.
Thank you for listening to the We Witches 3 podcast. For show notes and links, please go to www.wewitches3.com.